The day my father bought the car, my mother blew her top. A car? How could he buy a car? Had he forgotten how little he was making these days? Or how much it cost to send a kid to college? I was busy looking through the window on the driver's side. God, it was gorgeous. Red leather seats, a walnut dash, and a gleaming gear shift on the floor. For all his problems with money, my father was a classy man. I realized I could help him out. I'd just remind Mother how educational that car was. He could teach me how to drive. The lesson started the next day. I can still hear him screaming, "Don't strangle the steering wheel. Cradle it, cradle it. Don't yank the choke, ease it. Don't stomp the brakes, for God's sakes. Pump them, pump them. You're going to wreck the car." I felt terrible. I knew his doctor had told him to avoid stress. There were days his heart condition would barely let him work. This was a car we couldn't afford to fix. I worked hard to get better. Even when he was too tired to take me out, I'd practice driving in my mind till that car started to feel like a part of me. The only thing I couldn't get was the clutch. "Concentrate," he'd shout, but I couldn't. "What's the matter with you?" he'd yell, and I wouldn't know. It drove us both crazy. It was the last thing standing between me and a driver's test, and I just couldn't get it right. One afternoon, as we were bucking and grinding to a halt, he turned the key in the ignition, got out of his side, and stood right in front of the car. "All right," he said grimly. "Start again." I sat there waiting for him to tell me the joke was over, but he just stood there with the hood aimed right at his chest. "Look at me," he said, "and do it right." I started the engine, eased the car into first, and slowly lifted my foot. I could feel the heavy, oily teeth of the gears engaging and slowly, smoothly moving me and the car forward. I was doing it. I was really in control. A foot from the wall, he raised his hand, and I stopped the car. He looked at me from the darkness of the garage, nodded slowly, and with a little smile, walked back into the house. That weekend, I took my driver's test, and 5 days later, got my license in the mail. If I thought that meant I could finally get the car, I was mistaken. Except for short errands on city roads in broad daylight, he wouldn't even let me touch it. He was still treating me like a child. One afternoon, on my way back from school, I saw him stopped at a light. I was surprised. He was supposed to be at home resting. The light changed, and as he lifted his hand to shift, I saw the cigarette, something he'd sworn he'd given up. Then, with that little smile, he continued on his joyride, his gaze a million miles away, looking more happy than I'd seen him in a long, long time. That Saturday, we had a fight. I told him I needed the car to get to a meeting of the Honor Society, and he told me it was too dark and rainy to be driving. I stormed out of the house. The truth was I'd arranged to show some friends I could take the car from 0 to 60 in 7 seconds. He drove for fun. Why couldn't I? An hour later, as he lay sleeping, I stole his keys. The kids met me by the highway and piled into the car with a pack of beer. 10 minutes later, the police stopped me for speeding, arrested us for illegal possession, and took us straight to the station. My father got to the inspector's office around 10. Under the fluorescent light, he looked old and pale and sick, his gray, thinning hair wet from the rain, his fingers moving restlessly by his side. He needed a smoke, of course, and couldn't do it in front of me. He seemed almost more a prisoner than I was. The inspector called us in, and since I hadn't bought or drunk the beer, he let me go. My father drove back. I sat there, watching the darkness, and feeling like a total fool. My whole relationship with this car had been an absolute flop, and probably be grounded for a decade. We stopped outside the garage, and he turned off the ignition and looked at me. Then, he smiles and hands me the keys. "Here, kid," he says. "Why don't you take us for a spin?" We're back in the rain now, coasting down the highway. I'm shifting effortlessly, confident and watchful, aware of what a good driver I really am. What a wonderful thing he's done for me, I'm thinking, after all our fights, to trust me like this. Does he have any idea how much I admire him? Other fathers are younger, healthier, more able to make a living than he is, but every day, as his world's gotten smaller, he's done his best and always kept his style. We haven't said it in years, not since I was small and he was well, but before it's too late. I love you, Dad, I tell him. Son, he says, I love you too. Our ride never happened, of course. This was the 50s after all, and we were men. He just closed his hand around the keys. We both looked at our shoes and silently walked single file back into the house.